The air in the vault turns to glass. Your eyes lock onto the manifest's final line, the estimated arrival year. Your mind screams the impossible arithmetic. The journey was meant for 300 years. The ship's chronometer, which you passed this morning, glows with a different, astonishing truth. 247 years since departure. The simple subtraction changes everything. You haven't just missed your new world, you've overshot it by nearly 1,000 years. This is the story of a voyage that sailed past its future, and the generation that woke up to find itself a ghost. But to understand the weight of that gray cube in the vault, you must go back. You must go back to a ship's midnight and a 7-year-old shadow. I was 7 years old when I saw the vault open for the first time. It was a ship's midnight, the hour when the great hydroponic gardens exhale their stored oxygen and the corridors hum with a deeper, lonelier frequency. I should have been in my family's quarters, asleep, but I had followed the chief archivist, a woman whose silence was as much a part of the ship as the bulkheads. She moved through the dimmed arterial halls with a purpose I had never seen, her usual measured grace replaced by a tense, electric urgency. I was a shadow behind a coolant conduit when she stopped before a door I didn't recognize. It wasn't like the others, not brushed steel or composite, but a dull, non-reflective black, set flush with the wall in a forgotten service corridor deep in the ship's core. There was no designation plate, no access panel I could see. Just a seamless expanse darker than the shadows around it. She placed her palm against it. Not a scanner, just her bare skin on the cold surface. For a long moment, nothing. Then, a sound, not a mechanical click or a hydraulic hiss, but a deep, resonant thrum that traveled up through the deck plating into the bones of my feet. A vertical seam appeared in the blackness, splitting open to spill out a wash of blue emergency light. The kind used only for catastrophic systems failures. It painted her face in stark, skeletal planes. I remember the way her hands trembled. Not from fear, I think now, but from the sheer physical weight of the act. It was the tremor of someone lifting something they were never meant to move. She stepped inside. I dared to creep closer, pressing my cheek against the cold edge of the conduit. My breath held. The room beyond was small, a closet really, and it was empty except for a single pedestal. On it rested a simple gray cube. It was featureless, about the size of a child's head. It didn't glow or pulse. It just sat there, absorbing the blue light, looking profoundly, impossibly old. Older than the gardens, older than the oldest song in the archives, older somehow than the ship itself. The archivist didn't touch it. She simply stood before it, her shoulders slumped as if under a sudden terrible gravity. Then she whispered 4 words into the sterile air. They weren't meant for anyone, least of all a hiding child. They were a confession, a verdict, a prayer. This changes everything. The door sealed shut. The black wall was once more just a wall. The blue light vanished, leaving only the corridor's dim amber running lights. I ran all the way back to my bunk, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. I never spoke of it. To ask would have been to admit the trespass, and some deep instinctual part of me understood that what I had witnessed was not just a secret, but a kind of sacrilege. The memory itself became a vault I sealed within me. For years it felt like a dream, the blue light, the trembling hands, the silent cube. But the feeling it left was concrete. It was the feeling of finding an old family photo album in the attic, covered in dust that you were told never to touch. A specific, trembling anticipation. The knowledge that you are holding something that contains a version of your world that no longer exists, and that by opening it, you might dissolve the one you know. 2 decades later, I stand before the same black door. The corridor is unchanged, the same hum in the deck, the same scent of recycled air and ozone, but I am not a child hiding in shadows. I am the archivist now. The title was passed to me 3 days ago, after her quiet passing in the garden she tended. With the title came a key, not a physical object, but a sequence of neural pulses, a lock code imprinted directly into my biocircuitry upon her final breath. I understand now that her midnight pilgrimage was part of the transition, a silent lesson for the witness I was meant to become. My hands do not tremble as I raise them. The air feels thick, resistant. This is the threshold, on one side, the only world I have ever known, the gentle, perpetual rhythm of the ship, a civilization of millions born, living, and dying in transit, our purpose woven into the daily maintenance of the journey itself. On the other side of this seamless black door lies a single gray cube, and the truth of where we came from, and where we are going. I place my palm against the cold, dark surface. The deep thrum begins in the bones of the ship, and in mine. The thrum deepened from a vibration into a sound, a low, organic note that seemed to resonate from the ship's oldest bones. The black door dissolved, not sliding aside but fading from the center outward, like ink dispersing in water. The blue light washed over me, the same sterile emergency hue from my childhood memory. This time, I did not hide. I crossed the threshold. The vault was smaller than I had imagined. The air was 10 degrees colder, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and the dry, almost sweet smell of ancient polymers breaking down over centuries. It was the smell of something preserved past its intended lifespan. The only illumination came from a single overhead panel, its light flickering at a slow, arrhythmic pulse, casting long, trembling shadows. It illuminated rows of crystalline data drives set into recessed alcoves along the walls. Each one was the size of my forearm, faceted like quartz, and each hummed with a faint, persistent vibration I could feel in my teeth. This was the source of the thrum, not the door, but these sleeping crystals. A chorus of silent, stored voices. In the center of the room stood the pedestal, and upon it, the cube. Seeing it now as an adult, stripped it of any childhood fantasia, it was not mystical. It was austere, a perfect matte gray cube, its edges so sharp they seemed to cut the blue light around it. No seams, no ports, no insignia. Its age was not in its appearance, but in the space it occupied. It seemed to pull the light and sound from the room toward it, a sinkhole of quiet. This was the primary record, the seed from which all the crystalline drives drew their data, the source. I approached the pedestal. My footsteps were the only sound, each one echoing in the dense, cold air. This was the specific, heavy silence of a library just before it opens. When you're the only one there, a silence composed of a million waiting words. I was here to open it. To the right of the pedestal was the access terminal, a smooth, dark slate angled upward. As I neared, the ship's ambient hum, the ever-present breath of the engines, the circulation pumps, the distant life of millions seemed to grow quieter, as if the vessel itself were holding its breath. My hand hovered over the terminal. The activation protocol was in my blood, a neural command waiting to be unleashed. But a sudden, visceral understanding arrested me. My predecessor had stood here decades ago, her hands trembling. She had accessed this terminal. She had learned what was inside this gray cube, and the weight of that knowledge had bowed her shoulders for the rest of her life. She had tended her gardens, guided the archives, and never spoken a word of it. What had she seen that was so terrible, or so beautiful that it broke the world we knew? This was the threshold within the threshold. My hand hesitated. The flickering light made the shadows of my fingers dance across the terminal's surface. To initiate the sequence was to unseal the past, to learn why we were really here, to discover if our journey had a destination or if we were simply moving. A civilization built on a forgotten premise. The question was no longer one of curiosity, but of survival. Could a people who have built their entire meaning around the journey withstand knowing its end? I thought of the gardens, the schools, the nightly stories told to children about the great voyage. I thought of the quiet, purposeful life of the ship, all of it balanced on the contents of this silent gray cube. The terminal sensed my proximity. A soft green glyph glowed to life beneath my hovering palm, a circle bisected by a line. The universal symbol for begin. It was waiting. The entire silent archive was waiting, and in the deepened quiet, I could hear the ghost of a whisper, my own memory of a woman's voice in this very blue light. This changes everything. I took a breath of the cold, ozoned air, and I lowered my hand. My palm met the cool surface of the terminal. The green glyph flared, then dissolved into a constellation of silver-white symbols that flowed across the slate like water. They were not the angular, efficient script of the ship. These were fluid, cursive, almost organic, a language of curves and connections, not commands. My neural command, the one etched into my lineage, unspooled. It was not a key, but a greeting, a sequence of chemical memories, the taste of morning tea, the scent of paper, the feeling of sunlight on skin. A biometric handshake made of nostalgia. The gray cube did not open. It simply began. There was no screen, no hologram. The change was environmental. The low, crystalline hum from the walls shifted in pitch, harmonizing, weaving into a new frequency. The flickering blue light from the overhead panel steadied, warmed and softened into the gold of a late afternoon. But it was the air that changed first. The sterile, ozoned chill of the vault was displaced by a wave of warmth that carried a scent so profound, so alien, my knees nearly buckled. It was the smell of water on stone, of salt, of something green and vast and decaying. Petrichor, the word surfaced from some deep, genetic lexicon. The scent of rain on dry earth, an impossible smell. Our water is filtered, recycled, odorless. Our gardens smell of nutrient solution and clean roots. This was wet and wild and ancient. Then came the sound. It started as a distant rhythmic sigh, growing into a deep, resonant crash, followed by a hissing retreat, over and over. Ocean waves, I had seen simulations, flat visuals on a learning slate. This was not a simulation. This was a physical pressure in the room, a bass vibration I felt in my sternum, the hiss, a tangible spray against my cheeks. The sound filled the vault, not as noise but as space. It implied a horizon. Finally, the light resolved. The golden glow from the panel wasn't illumination. It was a window. It widened until the walls of the vault seemed to dissolve. Before me stretched an endless shifting plain of deep, impossible blue, capped with white foam that raced toward an unseen shore. Above it, a sky of a softer blue, streaked with wisps of white. And at the meeting point of water and sky, a blaze of liquid gold, a sun, not a point of light, but a disk, huge and warm, settling into the water. The light on the waves was a shattered mirror, a billion points of fire. This was not data. This was a memory, a sensory recording of such fidelity that it bypassed cognition and spoke directly to the lizard brain, to the marrow. My body recognized what my mind could not comprehend. My lungs ached for the thick, humid air. My skin prickled with the imagined warmth of that sun. A deep, homesick longing for a place I had never been, a place none of my people had seen for 700 years, hollowed me out. It was over in less than a minute. The gold light faded. The thunderous crash softened to a sigh, and then to silence. The scent of salt and rain dissolved back into ozone and polymer. The vault walls reasserted themselves, cold and close. The gray cube was just a cube again. I stumbled back from the pedestal, my hand pressed to my chest, as if I could slow the frantic beating of my heart. The overload was physical, a sensory concussion. I had accessed personal logs from the early voyage, heard the voices of the first generation. They spoke of technical challenges, of resource allocation, in the calm, measured tones of pioneers. This was different. This was raw, unmediated experience. This was not a ship log. It was a soul preserved. I understood my predecessor's trembling hands now. It wasn't terror. It was this. This visceral, staggering beauty, this proof of a world so abundant, so sensually rich, it made the ship feel like a sarcophagus. We lived in a world of recycled air, of artificial dawns, of a starfield that never changed. We told stories of Earth as a concept, the origin point, the cradle. We had no conception of its breath, its heartbeat. This was the first file. Not a mission brief, not a star chart, a memory of a sunset on a shore, a message in a bottle thrown back through time. It was like hearing a recording of your great-grandparents' voice for the first time, a familiar humanity in an unfamiliar timbre. The content was alien, but the emotion behind it, the sheer love in the preservation, was a mirror. I looked at the rows of humming crystals, hundreds of them. If the first was a sunset, what were the others? A forest, a storm, a child's laughter in an open field. The archive was not a database. It was a reliquary, a collection of lost senses. The philosophical crisis my predecessor faced snapped into focus. It was not about a destination, it was about the worth of the journey itself. How do you tell a people born in a hallway that they are headed toward a room, when the only record of that room is a recording of a window? And what if the window is more beautiful than the room could ever be? The cube held more than our past. It held a standard against which our entire existence would be measured, and I had just taken the first irrevocable step toward showing it to everyone. The weight of that decision settled onto my shoulders, heavier than any gravity the ship could simulate. I stared at the silent terminal. The green glyph was gone. In its place, a single pulsing dot of white light awaited my next command. The next file was waiting. The white dot pulsed, a gentle, patient rhythm. My hand hovered over the slate. The memory of the ocean was still a physical echo in my bones, a salt taste phantom on my tongue. To touch the dot was to invite another concussion of beauty, another anchor of longing. But the archive was not curated for wonder. It was a record. The next file would not be a sunset. I tapped it. The gold light and crashing waves did not return. Instead, the terminal's surface clarified into a grid of text and numbers, rendered in that same fluid cursive script, a manifest. The heading was stark: Project Longbow, primary mission parameters and chronological framework. My eyes, trained for decades on the ship's efficient logistics, scanned the columns: vessel designation, Odyssey, destination Gliese 667 cc, estimated transit duration 300 years, population at launch 10,000 souls, generational turnover projection 12, sustainable carrying capacity 15,000, all within expected parameters. These were the dry bones of the stories we told, the framework of our existence. Then I reached the final entry, estimated date of arrival. A string of numbers following a dating system I didn't recognize. A conversion algorithm was embedded in the file, a subroutine activated, a flicker of calculation across the slate. It translated the ancient date into the ship's own chronological standard, the continuous count that ticked on every main console, in every nursery marking the days since departure. The number resolved. My breath stopped. The manifest's estimated arrival year was a figure 947 years in the past. The air in the vault, already cold, seemed to solidify. I stared, my mind refusing the arithmetic. It was a simple subtraction. The journey was meant to last 300 years. The ship's chronometer, the one on the wall of the central hub that I passed every morning, currently read 1,247 years since departure. The math did not require an archivist. A child could do it. We had overshot our destination by nearly a millennium. A low metallic ringing started in my ears. I looked from the slate to the blank curved wall of the vault, as if I could see through it to the ship's spine, to the endless tunnel of our flight. The disorientation was profound, nauseating. It was that moment in a long car ride when you realize you've been driving in the wrong direction for hours and all the landmarks are wrong. Except the car was a world, and the ride had lasted for 30 generations. The destination, Gliese 667 cc's, the promised land, the reason was not ahead of us, it was behind us. A forgotten exit passed in the night centuries ago. We were not on a pilgrimage, we were on an endless, accelerating drift into nowhere. My fingers moved on their own, calling up subsections of the manifest navigation logs, engine performance metrics. The story was not one of catastrophic failure, but of quiet, incremental success. The first generation's engineers had perfected the magnetic scoop, the efficiency of the fusion drives. They had improved upon the improvements. The ship's velocity had crept steadily, wonderfully above projections. By the time of the third generation, they were traveling faster than planned, adding a buffer of years to their lifespan, a triumph. And then the manifest ended. The logs from the fourth generation onward were not here. This archive was sealed at the moment of that triumph, a snapshot of intent frozen in time. The subsequent centuries, the moment they passed the destination, the decision to stay silent, the rewriting of the mission into myth, were a void. Someone or some group had chosen to hide this, to let the ship become the universe. I released the slate. It clicked softly against the pedestal. The silence of the vault was no longer peaceful. It was complicit. This was the true weight my predecessor had felt, not the beauty of a lost earth, but the weight of an impossible detour. The philosophical crisis was a luxury. This was a navigational fact. I walked to the vault's door, my steps echoing in the hollow space. I palmed the release, and the thick seal hissed open. The corridor outside was deep in the ship's artificial night cycle, illuminated only by the dim blue running lights along the floor. The gentle hum of the life support systems was a sound so constant I only heard it in its absence. It was the sound of home. I followed the blue path to the central hub. The great chamber was empty, vast and shadowed. In the center of the far wall, illuminated by a soft downlight, was the official chronometer. A massive, polished plate of alloy, engraved with numbers that were updated every midnight by the ship's core. A monument to our endurance. 1247. The number glowed with a serene, green certainty. For my entire life, and for the lives of my parents, and their parents before them, that number had represented progress. A linear path through the dark. Now it was a tombstone. It marked not how long we had traveled, but how long we had been lost. I turned from the chronometer and moved to the main viewport, a vast, transparent alloy dome that formed the hub's ceiling. During the day cycle, it was crowded with people watching the stars. Now it was a private theater of the void. I lay back on one of the observation couches, the material sighing beneath me. Above, the stars were not the static points of the storybooks. At our velocity, they streamed. They were faint, luminous streaks against the absolute black, all pulled toward a single vanishing point ahead of the ship's bow. We called it the River of Heaven. We told children it was the current pulling us home. I watched the silent, graceful streaks. My mind supplied the new context. This was not a river carrying us forward. It was a wake. The luminous traces were the ghosts of stars we had passed, centuries ago, leaving our target far behind in the static dark astern. The beautiful, streaking sky was not a path to a future. It was a monument to a forgotten past, a headstone written in light. The ship slept around me, dreaming its own dreams of green worlds and golden suns. I was the only one awake, floating in the eye of a truth so vast it had no edges. The next file was waiting. But some discoveries are so large, you must learn to breathe around them first. The stars streamed on, indifferent to the story they had witnessed, and to the one that was now irrevocably beginning to unravel. I did not sleep. When the ship's gentle dawn cycle began, washing the corridors in a soft gold-tinged light, I was already walking. The urge to return to the vault was a physical pull, but a deeper instinct turned my steps elsewhere. Truth, once released, does not respect chains of command. It seeks the fertile ground. I went to the gardens. The central greenhouse occupied 3 full decks along the ship's spine, a world of warm, humid air that hit my skin like a sigh. The scent was loam and green growth, a perfume so fundamentally different from the vault's ozone chill, it felt like stepping into another reality. Mist hung in the air, catching the dawn spectrum lamps in tiny drifting rainbows. Rows of fruiting vines, tubers, and leafy greens stretched into the distance, a tapestry of sustenance woven by generations of hands. I found Alara at the far end of the tomato arbors. The lead gardener was a woman of few words, her hands more expressive than her face. She was pruning, her fingers deftly snapping a sucker from a thick main stem. She worked with a quiet reverence, as if each cut were a conversation with the plant itself. I stood for a long moment watching her, the words I had rehearsed dissolving in the moist, living air. "The archive was sealed for a reason," I said, my voice sounding thin against the gentle drip of the irrigation lines. Alara didn't turn. Her fingers brushed a broad, serrated leaf, feeling its texture. "I assumed it held something dangerous." "It does, but not in the way we thought." I moved closer, the packed earth soft under my boots. The mission parameters, the destination, the timeline, all of it was archived. We passed Gliese 667 CC 947 years ago. Her hand stilled on the vine. For a full minute, the only sound was the drip, drip, drip from the overhead pipes and the distant hum of the nutrient circulators. A ladybug, a tiny speck of engineered crimson, traversed the leaf she had been touching. "Past it," she repeated, the word flat. "Overshot by centuries." The drives were too efficient. It was a success, until it wasn't. Someone in the 4th generation or the 5th must have realized. They sealed the record. They let the destination become a myth, and the ship become the only home. Alara finally turned her eyes, the color of the soil she tended, held no shock, only a deep, weary calculation. She looked past me, down the endless, productive row of plants, each one a promise of a future harvest. Her gaze traveled over the mist-shrouded fruit trees in the distance, the racks of wheatgrass, the pollinator drones humming lazily from blossom to blossom. This was her life's work, not just maintaining, but improving, enriching the soil for the next planting, and the next. She looked back at the tomato vine in her hand, at the promising yellow flower just beginning to unfurl. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet it was almost lost in the humidity. "Then what are we growing this for?" The question did not echo. It settled into the warm air. Heavy and final, it was the question the vault had been designed to prevent. I thought of the people on Earth, in the final days before launch, planting saplings in courtyards they would never see mature, a gesture of faith in a future they had entrusted to us. This was the inverted mirror of that act. Planting a tree in your yard only to learn your house is slated for demolition next year. The futility of nurturing something with no future. We were tending an orchard for a shore we would never reach, for a sun that was not ours. I had no answer. The philosophical crisis was no longer an abstract concept. It was here, in the scent of basil and the weight of a ripe tomato. It was in the calloused hands of the woman waiting for a reason to make her next cut. Alara did not cry. She simply let her hand fall from the vine. She looked at her palms, at the fine lines of dirt etched into her skin, a map of her purpose. The question hung between us, expanding to fill the vast glassed-in space. It touched every leaf, every root, every seed waiting in cold storage for its turn in the soil. "What are we growing this for?" The gentle, rhythmic drip of the irrigation system was the only sound, a metronome counting beats in a song that had lost its lyrics. I left Ilara standing in the mist. The question she planted followed me through the humid air, out the heavy greenhouse doors, and into the sterile corridor. My feet carried me upward, through the residential rings and the silent hydroponic sectors, until I reached the observation dome at the ship's forward apex. It was twilight in the dome. The internal lights dimmed to a deep indigo to simulate night. The great crystal viewport, a single curved pane meters thick, was cold against my forehead when I leaned forward. My breath fogged the glass in slow, rhythmic clouds. Beyond it, the stars slid past in their silent, meaningless procession. I had studied their catalogued names, Arcturus, Vega, Sirius, but the names were empty now, just points on a map to a place we would never be. The ship's velocity was a constant, gentle hum in the deck, a vibration you felt in your bones. We were moving with tremendous purpose toward absolutely nothing. It felt like sitting alone in a quiet, empty train station late at night, watching schedules for destinations that no longer matter. The architecture of purpose, devoid of its soul. The stars were not landmarks. They were just scenery, an eternal changing painting on the other side of the glass. I do not know how long I stood there. Time had become untethered, both inside the vault and out here in the void. The crisis was not a shout, it was this silence. It was the realization that every song we sang, every child we named, every law we passed in the council chambers was built on a foundation of deliberate amnesia. We were a civilization born in a hallway, believing it was a palace. The internal lights of the ship began their slow circadian brightening for the night cycle, a soft amber glow rising from the floor plates. It cast my long, distorted shadow across the empty dome's deck, stretching it thin and grotesque toward the far wall. Other shadows emerged from the railings and support struts, a forest of dark shapes reaching for nothing. I watched my breath fog clear from the crystal, the stars sharpening once more into cold, perfect points. A new, quieter question formed, not about purpose, but about guilt. What do you do when you discover the lie, but the people living within it are happy? When the truth is a solvent that will dissolve the glue holding their world together? I thought of the children in the creche, learning the old fictional star charts. I thought of the engineers who tuned the great engines with such pride. The lights reached their full nighttime luminescence. The dome was no longer a place of starlight, but of long, still shadows and artificial amber. I turned my back on the meaningless stars. The walk back to my quarters felt longer than the journey we had already made. The question of guilt turned to a question of duty. By the time the artificial dawn brightened my quarters, the decision was made. The truth could not be a secret I carried alone. It was a structural flaw in the ship's spine, and everyone had a right to know the hull they lived inside was not what they believed. I called a council for midday in the main mess hall. It was the only space large enough, a cavernous chamber, 3 decks high with vaulted arches of support struts. The long tables, usually buzzing with shift-change chatter, were pushed back against the walls. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint metallic tang of the air scrubbers working overtime. Light fell in broad, artificial shafts from the high ceiling panels, illuminating floating dust motes in the still air. They came not as a panicked mob, but slowly in ones and twos. The hydroponicists with soil under their nails, the water reclamation techs, their hands still damp, the creche teachers, their expressions carefully neutral. They found seats on the benches or stood leaning against the bulkheads, a quiet, watchful gathering of a few dozen, the heart of our world waiting. I stood on a maintenance crate at the room's center, the crystalline data drive cold and heavy in my palm. I did not begin with the ocean sounds or the green horizons. I began with the numbers, 300 years, 1,247. The manifest's destination coordinates and our own navigational starfix, showing we had passed that point in the void centuries ago. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet, each fact dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep, dark pool. I described the vault, the hum of the ancient drives, the deliberate erasure of our original purpose. I told them we were not a mission, but a memory, a people living in the long, quiet aftermath of a forgotten goal. I expected shouting. I expected the sharp urgency of a hull breach, the scramble for a solution that did not exist. I braced for it. The silence that followed was different. It was not shock. It was absorption. A quiet settling of a new, uncomfortable weight. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a voice spoke. It was Kale, the ship's lead engineer. She stepped forward, wiping her hands on a stained rag, a smudge of grease like a dark tattoo across her cheekbone. Her eyes were not on me, but on the drive in my hand, as if assessing its function. "The archive is fascinating," she said, her voice calm, carrying easily in the quiet hall. "A historical curiosity, but you are reading it as an instruction manual we failed to follow." She tucked the rag into her belt. "The engines are fine. I tuned the primary reactor myself last week. The life support is fine. The air you're breathing is clean. The water is sweet. The gardens are productive." She looked around the room, making eye contact with the gardener from the hydroponics bay, with a teacher from the creche. "We are not a mission that failed. We are a home that succeeded." It was the moment in a family argument when someone points out that the problem is actually the foundation of your daily life together. The tension in the room didn't break, it transformed. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, not of alarm, but of recognition. A young hydroponicist stood up. "My great-great-grandmother was born in hydroponics sector 4. I maintain her tomato cultivars. Is her life less because the sector number isn't on an old map?" A creche teacher spoke softly. "The children's songs about the starry shore, they're about belonging, not about arriving." The debate that unfolded was not about course corrections or engine burns. It was about definitions, about whether a purpose granted from the past was more valid than a purpose built by the living. Kale listened, her arms crossed, a slight frown of concentration on her face as if listening to a subtle harmonic in the ship's hum. I realized I had called this council expecting to be the bearer of truth. I had not expected to have that truth reframed, not as a crisis, but as a revelation of our own autonomy. The council broke without consensus, as I knew it would. There were those who looked haunted, staring at their hands as if seeing the ghost of Earth in their fingerprints. Others left talking animatedly, their gestures broad, as if a weight had been lifted. Kale caught my eye as she turned to leave, giving a single, slow nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. The grease smudge on her cheek caught the light. I was left alone in the vast mess hall, the tables like silent ships beached against the walls. Her words lingered in the recycled air, a new vibration beneath the old hum. We are a home that succeeded. The crisis was not a failure of the ship, but a failure of my own imagination. I had been an archaeologist, digging for a lost blueprint. She was an engineer, assessing the integrity of the structure standing before her. And the structure was sound. It was living. It was breathing the air it made. The forward reference, the quiet hook that lodged in my mind as I watched the last person leave, was the look in the eyes of the few who had said nothing at all. The deep archivists, the lore keepers. Their silence was not agreement. It was the silence of people who know that every transformation has a cost, and who were already calculating what, in this new home, might have to be sacrificed to build its future. That evening I returned to the vault alone. The mess hall's debate was a distant murmur in the ship's veins. I needed the quiet hum of the archive, the blue emergency light, the scent of ozone. I needed to see what I had missed. I bypassed the mission logs and the star charts. My fingers, guided by something deeper than curiosity, selected a different crystalline array. It was labeled not with coordinates or manifests, but with a single glyph I'd overlooked, a circle intersected by a winding line, a stylized river, a path. It activated not with data, but with feeling. A man's voice, weathered and soft, filled the cold chamber. He was not reporting, he was speaking to someone he loved across the light years. He described the ache in his hands from a day spent calibrating sensors, and how the recycled air in his quarters always carried the faint metallic taste of regret. Then he recited a poem about the color of Earth's sky, not just blue, but a specific aching cerulean he saw once over an ocean whose name we've lost. The words were clumsy, beautiful. A hologram shimmered to life beside the drive, not a schematic, but a rolling field of tall grass under a yellow sun bending in a wind we cannot feel. This was not the archive's official record. This was its hidden heart. File after file unfolded, not instructions, but artifacts of living, a woman's composition for a string instrument that no longer exists, its notes echoing the rhythm of a forgotten season. A child's drawing of the ship labeled home, tucked into a personal log. Love letters between crew members, filled with the ache and wonder of knowing they would die in the metal halls where they were then whispering. I sat on the cold deck, the light of 100 lost summers playing across my hands. I understood my error completely. I had been searching for a destination in these crystals, but they did not contain a map to a new world. They were a manual for building a world in the void. The original crew, in their first lonely decades, faced the same abyss we did. Their answer was not in reaching ashore, but in learning how to sail. They left us their art, their grief, their stubborn joy, not as a monument to what was lost, but as the first seeds planted in the ship's sterile soil. It is like finding a box of old love letters in an attic. The story isn't about the ending, whether the couple lived happily ever after. The story is in the trembling handwriting, the pressed flower, the way they learned to build a life together day by uncertain day. The archive's true purpose was never to guide us to a new world. It was to teach us how to build one from memory and hope, using the only materials we have, each other and time. The final hologram was simple. It showed the original chief archivist, a woman with tired eyes, sitting in a room much like this one. She looked directly at the recorder, as if across the centuries, and spoke 7 words before the file ended. The journey is the destination. Tend it well. The hum of the drive seemed different then, not the hum of dormant data, but the steady living pulse of a heart preserved in crystal. I powered down the array. The ghosts of fields and oceans faded, leaving only the blue glow and the familiar scent of home. I sealed the vault, not to hide the truth, but to protect its delicate human core. The future would not be found in a course correction. It would be built as it always had been, in the gardens, the creches, the quiet conversations in the mess hall. We were not a lost mission. We were a found people, and our voyage was just beginning.